War is and has always been one of the most controversial and hotly contested subjects. Today, Robert Greene is here, author of the 33 Strategies of War. It's an insightful look at some of the major battles and leaders in history, how they apply to our world today, and what we can learn from them on and off the field. Pleasure to have you here today, Robert.
Thank you for having me, Greene.
Well, as I say, you really cover all of the major battles from ancient times, from ancient China to ancient Greece to the present day. But it's hard to read this book without thinking of Iraq.
Right.
Although you don't directly take Iraq head on, but yet, being the strategist that you are, I'm sure that you have some thoughts on the subject. How are we doing in Iraq? How's it going?
Well, it's obviously going very badly. Everybody knows that. It's no great mystery. I'm not saying anything you can't see in the newspaper, but you know, it's interesting because I was writing the book as the war was developing. And from the very beginning, I would be telling my girlfriend, and she can attest to this, that I would be saying, I can't see how this will end. I just can't see how that you could logically remove yourself eventually from Iraq and that it would be stable in any form. There's no end game here. And one of the most important chapters in the book is about knowing how to end things well, the exit strategy.
That's what I thought of,
which is very important for life, for business, and obviously for war. And I think people got into this war, you don't hear about this very often, but I think they got pulled into it for emotional reasons. Post 9/11, there was a little bit of anger, there was a little bit of sense of retribution. There was also this sort of rosy scenario that a lot of the neoconservatives were building up about this building a bastion of democracy in the Middle East. And people didn't think through this whole thing in a very rational way about what is the end game. And to me, it's a basic violation of one of the most solid military principles. So I can't see how it could, once you enter something without a proper exit strategy, it's almost, the more you try to get out of it, the worse it gets.
Well, and that's why I wanted to ask you your opinion, because, you know, obviously this is a very political subject. There are a lot of feelings on both sides. And I didn't know what you were going to say, by the way, because I didn't ask you in advance. But yet, I like the fact, though, that I think that one problem I have with a lot of this discussions in the general public on both sides is that I have a feeling that people don't really put it in the context of history. And so I wanted to get your opinion because I know obviously that's what you've been doing is studying other military battles and things throughout history. So I thought it'd be interesting to get your perspective since you have studied all of the other major...
Well, I think what I'm trying to do is I'm removing it from the realm of this heated political discussion. I'm not saying Bush is this evil person or anything like that. I'm looking at it strictly from a strategic point of view. How would a great general in the past, how would Napoleon look at this campaign? How would Grant or Sherman or Patton look at this? And I think clearly that this was a failure in the planning stage. And
what would Napoleon do?
Napoleon would have never gotten into such a thing like this, you know.
Although he did have his Russia.
He did have his Russia, yes. Napoleon had 10 great years of the greatest, most brilliant years of warfare, and then 10 years of decline and disaster. The main thing is, I compare this to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the 1970s. That's, to me, the closest parallel. And when you signal to the countries in that region, a very volatile region, that you're trying to plant democracy there and that you're basically wanting to get rid of the regimes in Iran, Syria, perhaps Saudi Arabia, it's in their long-term interest that you fail. So that's why I'm saying I don't see how this could end. When you pull the troops out in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, you're surrounded by all of these countries that don't want Iraq to work. Just like when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, nobody wanted the Soviet Union to succeed there.
So you don't think there will be some sort of popular uprising or support that would, for democracy, that you think that the governments will be able to resist the trend?
Well, first of all, you cannot, this is where I say strategy is a really important subject. And you have to, these are certain principles that are really important that once you understand, it kind of guides your actions through things. So the notion that you can kind of plant democracy in soil that has never, where there's no tradition of democracy, where you have a country that's basically an artificial creation in the 1920s that was basically created by England and you know, various other powers. There's no way that this is going to take root in 2 or 3 or 4 years. It's almost like these people have attention deficit disorder. They're so impatient. They're tied into the 4-year election cycle, and they think that they can create democracy in just a couple of years when something like that can take 20, 30, 40 years.
Right, so you definitely think it'll take a generation or two, which is what I
No, I think this is going to be a disaster. I was telling my girlfriend from the beginning, This could be one of the great military disasters of our time.
So you think it is another Vietnam?
It could be worse than Vietnam.
Worse than Vietnam.
And I don't mean to be alarmist. It could not be. But the potential is that you're going to drag in all of these other countries into the conflict. That's what I was saying before, when you're signaling to Iran, Syria, Saudi Arabia, that you have bigger interests. This is a grand strategic plan to bring democracy to the Middle East. You're going to be dragging all of these countries into a regional war where you have something like oil, which is so vital resource. Nothing like Vietnam had these kinds of consequences. This could be a great disaster.
Well, you bring up a few good points. And one thing I want to, you mentioned the comparison to Afghanistan.
Yes.
Obviously, that did not go so well for the Soviets, and you go into some of the details in the book about what happened with their strategy.
Yes.
But yet, the U.S. has had a better experience in Afghanistan. What do you think of how we're doing in Afghanistan, and how does that compare to Iraq? Why is it going comparatively well in Afghanistan, but yet not so well in Iraq?
Well, you hear reports that things aren't necessarily going so well in Afghanistan, that there is tremblings of a civil war, of resistance going on there, where Afghanistan actually could turn into more of a Vietnam. It's hard to say. I'm not quite sure. But the thing was, the whole point of it was to knock out the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. And for that purpose, going to Afghanistan made sense and was logical. But then we took our eye off the ball and we went into Iraq. And the whole question is, how do you deal with terrorism? Which is, I have a chapter in the book, strategy number 33, about what is the most rational way of dealing with terrorism. And if the point of going into Afghanistan, or the point of the post 9/11 strategy, was to end the war on terror, end terrorism, I make the point in the book that the military way of doing this is often the worst choice. That really, the smart thing to do is to figure out where does the money come for these terrorists, how do they communicate to each other, and to be very rational and strategic and knock out what is sort of their base, what we call in warfare their center of gravity. So I don't even know, okay, Afghanistan was necessary, but I think the whole foundation of the strategy that our country is applying in the war on terror is actually very misguided.
Well, and that is something I wanted to ask you about, because there's almost a sense that, well, first of all, in a more general level, has war changed permanently? I mean, it doesn't seem as though you have a straight-on battle anymore, that, it's all these people putting roadside bombs out. And I mean, do you think, is there some sort of change in the nature of warfare, or is it just in this particular situation? And
well, there are two schools of thought in warfare, in military strategy. One is that essentially nothing has changed since the beginning of time, since wars have been fought for how many thousands of years. And the other is that technology and weaponry has completely altered the nature of war. I'm of the first camp, that essentially warfare hasn't changed.
And because you do mention that there were terrorist incidents all the way back from ancient times.
There were. The Jews in ancient Rome were practicing terrorism against the Romans, and then I talk in there about the 12th century sect in Islam called the Assassins.
Which gave us the word in English.
Which gave us the word assassins, and were probably the first first terrorist campaign. It's been around. The nature of having weapons such as bombs and putting airplanes into buildings has sort of altered the game. And the point I make in the book is that what terrorists are after, and they've been after since it's begun, is to create as much chaos and disorder as possible. It's usually a group of people who are very small in number and who are very desperate. And this is their last means, their last resort. They can't even wage a guerrilla-style campaign. And so they want to create maximum chaos. They try at one little kick of a rock, and they try to start an avalanche. And so your response to terrorists has to be very measured. They want to suck you into a kind of a dynamic where you overreact. And in the overreaction, they have the power. They control the dynamic.
Because it's very psychological.
Yes. Well, all war is very psychological in its basis. And that's the point I make. All strategies are based on kind of working on the psychology of your opponent and putting them on the defensive or whatever. But terrorism is the ultimate psychological warfare. Yes. And the only people who've succeeded in history, and there have been those who've succeeded, are those who take a very measured, calculated, rational response